Excited to have you today. Been a long time friend of the Flower City Art Center, even before it was called that. She's going to talk a little bit about her past work and her residency at the Art Center, and also show us what she's working on now. And I just have to say, these Sunday afternoon talks have been amazing and kind of therapeutic in such a weird time.
Yes.
It's been really good to connect with you all. So take it away, Jen.
Thank you very much, Juliana.
We'll take questions and comments after Jen finishes, okay?
Thanks, Juliana. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. And thank you, Juliana and Liz and Ross and everybody for helping to coordinate this Artist Talk series. My name is Jen Pereña, Jennifer Pereña, but you guys can call me Jen. I have been, as Juliana said, associated with the Flower City Art Center now for almost 2 decades. I started taking classes quite a while ago, and I'm gonna show a variety of sort of past work that led me to where I am today with kallitypes, as well as some of my current kallitype work. We'll talk a little bit about some process, and I'll talk a little teeny bit about some of my ideas for what I want to do next with this process and like future project ideas. I'm going to go ahead and advance and have some slides in the background to kind of corroborate parts of my historic story. So just going back like a long ways to talk for a moment, I've always been an artistic sort of a child, always drawing, always making crafts. And I do a variety of different arts and crafts. I make greeting cards, I knit. Some of you have been the recipients of some of my gifts. But I've always loved photography particularly. My grandfather was an early adopter of photographic technology when he was in the Navy in the 1930s and 40s. And my dad had a photography business for a while, and my mom is a painter. So I was always also surrounded in a household full of art by people that wouldn't have considered themselves artists, but would have just thought they did art as a hobby and they were particularly talented. So in high school, I had the fortune to take a darkroom photography class, and I learned how to develop my own film and make my own prints, and I really enjoyed it, but there was no way to continue that as I went on to college and then later when I moved to Africa to volunteer. And so when I moved back to Rochester in 1995, I had a lot of rolls of film that I had been taking from my years in college and my years in Africa that I didn't know what to do with. And another bit of good fortune was in 2002, I got laid off from a job that provided me with a great severance package. And, you know, there's always a shining, like a silver lining to all these stories. I couldn't find another job right after getting laid off. So I used part of the severance to make art and take some classes. So I took some classes at Rochester's Memorial Art Gallery and a darkroom refresher class at the Community Darkroom, which is nowadays called the Department of Photography and Digital Arts at Flower City Art Center. Back then, Community Darkroom at the Genesee Center. And in that first darkroom refresher class, we learned all the darkroom processes, and we also started making work. And we had a group of people that really loved photography, and we were allowed to use the darkrooms for free as part of our classes. So we would go in the darkrooms all together and make work, and eventually a group of us became volunteers at the Community Darkroom, and then there was a series of photographic exhibits annually that the volunteers and former students could show work they'd been making. And the images that you see on this slide are some of my favorites from some of those early years, probably between 2002 and maybe 2006 or 7. I was still making traditional, I would say, prints in the darkroom using RC paper. These are all actually large size 11 by 14 prints that were exhibited in different shows. But what would happen is after I would make, spend the time in the darkroom, what I was enjoying the most was being around the people. Like, I like to go in the darkroom because all my friends were in the darkroom, and we would hang out and we would look at each other's work. And although, yeah, I think these pictures are interesting, they would just go in a box after the exhibit was done, and I really wasn't doing anything else with them. So I was feeling a little bit maybe dissatisfied overall with this experience of traditional darkroom photography. Fast forward then to 2005, when we had our first opportunity to take what I sort of lump into an alternative process class. And Pat Kane, who was one of our former instructors, offered a class on Holga. And then later on in that same year, after we had done a lot of, Holga photography and developed our Holga negatives, and the Holga negatives are slightly larger size than the traditional 35mm film that I had been shooting. This is 110. Then we had a platinum and palladium printing class. I took that and used my Holga negatives, and these are some of my favorite images from that class. These, as you can see, look more like, if you're familiar with my work at all, the kallitype work, look more like my kallitype work in that the emulsion is hand applied to a piece of paper using a brush. You can see the brush strokes, which exceed the size of the negative. So, this is a little tree series. You can see that there's some like dots. These are reflections. If you look, this is an apple backwards because I just took these with my iPhone. All of these pieces are actually framed and in boxes, not actually up on the walls of my home, because they were sort of lucky outcomes from classes. The chemistry for the platinum and palladium was quite expensive, and I never took the class again. And so, I have these pieces that are not easy to disassemble the frames in order to take proper scanned pictures. And I was saying to Juliana when we were just beginning that, I take a class, I would love the work in the class, but then I wouldn't know how to make that work again. I wouldn't know, I wouldn't feel confident to mix my own chemistry or to do the process independently without the guidance of an instructor. And so, I never thought to take proper pictures to document the work or to really like scan them to be able to do anything else with. So I apologize, you're going to see the quality of some of the reproductions here are not so great. But I really did like the look of these, and I liked the process with more steps. And that sort of then morphed into the opportunity to take more and more classes. I took some wet plate collodion classes and wet plate and dry plate tintype classes. I think altogether I took 5 of those classes. These are a few of the tintypes. You can see the collodion, sort of like the residue and the corners where I had, tilted the plate to drip the extra chemistry off. This is a series of yarn. I actually bought all of this yarn. I think one time Sharon and I went to the Fiber Festival in Hemlock, and I bought all this yarn and fiber, and I thought the texture of it was so cool. And you can also see that these are not perfect. So not only do I have the residue of the collodion, I've got like some little chips and some little dust marks, but I was starting at this point to really love not only the process, but the fact that even though the work wasn't quote unquote perfect, it was very interesting. Like I loved the fingerprint that you have from where you hold on to the plate when you're, manipulating the collodion on it. And I love the fact that because of the imperfections, each one was a totally unique piece that you really, you could scan that and print it, but you couldn't make that exactly again. And I also did some glass plates. I did, and I took an ambrotype course, I took the wet plate collodion a number of times, so I've got glass positives. This one is a image from a slide that my father took of my mother before I was born, and it's printed on a piece of black glass. These others are just on clear glass with a piece of white paper behind them. And I actually, one that I really wanted to include, but I couldn't scan, I'm going to try to show you guys. I know there's a bit of glare, but you can see these are some glass plates that are just put against a piece of gold foil. And again, the way that it's framed, you can see I couldn't really easily disassemble that without sort of ruining the frame. But again, examples of things that I had done in class where, to make that work again on my own, I didn't really have the confidence to create the collodion and keep the collodion really properly maintained and create the silver bath and have that be non-contaminated and, be using all the chemistry enough to keep it actively, let's say, viable, and then at the same time troubleshoot, so that I wasn't going to be in a situation where I might be in the darkroom and create a mess and then not know how to clean it up, because really we were renting a public space that was used by the rest of the community. But again, I loved this process. I kept taking the class specifically because I loved the class. And that led me to the kallitype class that was offered in 2015. And I've been, since this time, sort of like fell in love with this particular process, and this has carried me forward to today. The first class was offered as sort of a jumble of alternative processes altogether, taught by John Merritt, who's one of the other speakers in the May Sunday afternoon series, although he did his on a Saturday. And this particular image is what I've done for the next few slides is I've got the original image, which I'm going to talk about more in a moment, and the finished kallitype. Some of them are hand colored, as this one is, and some of them are just selenium toned. But you can see sort of the original was full of color, like full of life, really inspiring to me to see these brightly colored heirloom carrots. And I was really lucky to get a great print in that first class with John. And then I decided, also sort of being a little bit inspired by the students that I was working with in an after-school youth program called Studio 678, or at the time it was 678, now it's 789, but it's part of the youth programming of the Flower City Art Center. My students were actually watercoloring their RC photographs, or coloring them over the top, and they were getting beautiful results. And it really just got me thinking about the fact that I had done that before, but I hadn't tried it with any of my alternative process prints. So the carrots was sort of the first one that I ever did, that I really liked how it turned out. Now, if John were here, and maybe when he listens to this later, he would always say to me, you should have made it brighter. Like, you should have, tried to get the paint to look as bright as the original. But I like the subtlety in it. And again, I like the fact that even if I printed that carrot image numerous times, each one of the kallitype prints would have been unique and different. And then the painting would always be a little bit unique and different. So I've got a few examples here. This one also I did from a class, Japanese lanterns. You can see that I had to do a little bit of cropping on the original digital image, which all of the images that I use for kallitypes are made with an iPhone. The iPhone I had back in 2015 was an iPhone 6, and then I've graduated sort of now. I have an iPhone 10, and so I'm not shooting RAW. I'm not shooting like with a 35mm camera, or like a higher end digital camera. I like the fact also that the iPhone is so accessible. I can just snap something wherever I am. And a lot of times I'm inspired by things I'm seeing during my time in public markets, or during outings in nature, skiing in the wintertime. So here you can see on the right, the cropped image, and then how I watercolored over the top of that. And you can even see when you're looking at it that it's not super sharp, right? There's like, it looks like some sort of like degradation maybe of the chemistry, where you got sort of some dots. And again, that's the kind of thing that I just love seeing. That kind of thing come through makes it more unique. This one is an example of a piece that I made during my artist residency. So I'm sort of jumping ahead again, that from 2015 to 2018, I took the kallitype process class with the same instructor, John Merritt, 4 times. And I kept taking it over and over because, again, there were a lot of moving parts and I wasn't confident to do this work on my own. But after taking the class 4 times, I was amassing a body of work and gaining in confidence, where whenever the class would end and there would be a little extra chemistry, I would get permission from John, and at the time Sharon, to go in and use up that last chemistry, because there wouldn't be another class for a while and you never knew how good the chemistry would be if you let it sit on the shelf for a number of months in between classes. So I was going in and using up that little bit of chemistry, and sort of getting confident with, I could buy my own chemistry and I could start to finish make my own prints, but I still needed a little bit of help transitioning this original digital image into a negative that I could use, because the kallitype process itself is a contact printing process, which means that the resulting image is only as big as the starting negative. And so these images are actually 8 by 10 in size. So that means I took the digital image and I made it into an 8x10 size image in the computer using Adobe Photoshop. And then I manipulated that and printed it onto a piece of plastic. I use a product called Pictorico Ultra, and then I made a negative out of that. And I'll show you a few more process GIFs and some pictures in just a few moments. Now, this particular image, though, I chose to include because it also shows another sort of quote unquote happy accident. And my friend Emilio, who's here on the call, recently recommended that I watch the documentary about Sally Mann. And Sally Mann is a photographer that I've known about for a long time and I really admire, but I hadn't seen the documentary. And during the documentary, she has a statement that she makes about how most of her favorite images that she's ever made are like where there's been a hand from some other being that wasn't hers that impacted the final output of whatever her image is. So like, for example, she would go into the field and set up her portable darkroom and pour her collodion onto a large plate intending to make a landscape, and then a truck would go by and kick up a bunch of dust and it would all land right on the wet collodion. And so she'd have all these little pieces of dirt on the plate, but she'd go ahead and expose it. And then when you looked at the final print, you had all these really interesting marks from where the dirt would have like been blowing across the plate and made these little tiny skid marks. And I kind of feel that way with a lot of my work where, you know, I'm in the right place at the right time to get an image to begin with. And then I go and I do the best job that I can digitally in Adobe Photoshop, but I'm definitely not an expert. And then I go into the darkroom to do all my process, but some days you have a bad day and you can't coat very well. Other days you've mixed your chemistry, but there's contamination. On this particular day, I was actually already in my artist residency, which I started in like August of 2018. And I was trying to test the different kinds of developer that are available to work with the kallitype process to try to determine which one I really liked that I would want to commit to for the rest of my work. And this image on the right was made with the Bostic and Sullivan kallitype developer, which is basically just called the black developer. And it requires a clearing agent, and the clearing agent requires its own tray. And I was in the darkroom one day feeling like I can't mess with another tray because the darkroom sink is only so long, and I had a bath for my developer, a washing tray, a bath for my Selenium for toning, a bath for my fixer, and a final washing bath. And there was no wiggle room on that sink for another tray for clearing agent. So I did one of these things that I always do, and Marianne and Sharon have had this experience with me many times where I'm sort of like, don't know what to do next, better call in the experts. So I called John Merritt and I said, do I have to use the clearing agent because I don't know where to put this other tray? And he said, well, I don't know what's going to happen if you don't use it. Go ahead and make the prints and just see what happens. And what happens is you get staining. And so what you see on this one is a yellowish stain all over the whole image, which, to be honest, I don't mind. So again, it wasn't really like proper technique, but it was something that came out looking really interesting. And then when I hand applied the watercolor over the top, I just liked the tones that I was able to get. So that's sort of the way that I work, is like, you know, a little trial and error, sometimes not totally prepared, but I make the best of it. And I think that the work that ends up is usually sort of very interesting. The next ones that I've got now are to show you a few more sort of accidents that still ended up looking good. This one is, I call this Winter Road. The image on the right, you can see the brush strokes. Can you guys see all those brush strokes in there? So it's an example where the coating wasn't done really well. I still like how it looked because, excuse me, the other lines that I have in the rest of the road, excuse me, I think kind of go along with that. This next one was an example where I made the negative, excuse me. Sorry about that. But I forgot to flip it when I was in Photoshop. And so I actually made sort of the opposite. So you can see the original image here, which has this tree line in the fog more to the right side of the image, but in my actual kallitype print, it's on the left. I still like how it looks. So, you know, I never went back and fixed the negative. And then this final one is a snowdrift. And this I included to show you that, you know, the original iPhone image had a little bit of distortion, a little bit of the highlights blown out in the upper corner. Texturally, I felt like it was super interesting, but the kallitype process actually results in a much more contrasty image. And you can see that the final image was so dark, so black. But I really think it turned out cool. And that little bit of blown out highlight, I don't mind it at all when I see the kallitype image over here. So I guess showing you a smattering of things here is really just goes to show that you can still, with this particular process, have a lot of positive, what do I want to say, a lot of positive outcomes, even if you're still sort of trial and erroring it as you go. So let me just talk for a few more moments about my residency, and then that will lead up to my next slide. So after having taken the kallitype class a number of times, I was asked by the former director, Megan Charland, if I would do a solo show in the Darkroom galleries. And I said, you know, I think I probably have enough work, and I think I have enough chemistry that I could go in the darkroom and make new work, and probably I would get like 10 images. But then some things changed at the center, and I wasn't able to get into the center during normal working hours because I work a full-time job outside of making photography, and I wasn't sure how I was going to actually make the work. And so Megan and I chatted and decided that a residency would be a great alternative. And the residency allowed me to have keys and 24/7 access to the center. I was able to store all of my chemistry and my paper and my materials. I was able to go in anytime that I was free and make my work. And I had a 6-month window to make work for the exhibit, as well as cut my own mats, put all my framing together, hang the exhibit. And we even did an artist talk and a demo. And it was an amazing experience that, for me, never having gone to art school, never having formally studied photography, photographers, not having a large body of experiential work behind me in a more, let's say, really focused amount of years or amount of hours or whatever you would want to quantify darkroom time. It was something that really allowed me to focus on this work. And I'd go in the darkroom sometimes for up to 10 hours and just, you know, you lose yourself in those hours where there's no other people, there's nothing really interacting with you. You're just focused on making work, and the time just like floats away. It's one of those things about art that I find so therapeutic. And although I think I'm doing a good job at speaking pretty slowly for this presentation, normally I speak really fast, I move really fast in my daily work and life, I move pretty fast. And the darkroom gives me a chance to sort of slow it all down, get rid of the noise, only focus on the work that I'm making. And so I really am fortunate to have that in my life, and to be in a city of Rochester where we have such a gem as the Flower City Art Center and such a creative community of supportive artists. So that leads me to my next slide, which was after my residency ended, I did an artist talk. And at that time, some folks said, you know, what's going to come next for you? What are you going to do next? And I said, I don't think I'm going to do anything else, because, you know, I don't have the residency any longer. I wasn't sure how I would be able to sort of continue on making more work for another exhibit. But I still had some chemistry left. I still had a lot of paper left, and I decided to become a 24/7 renter of the photography and digital arts department. So I kept my keys and I kept my drawer, and I kept making work. And I had been to Italy to visit my friend Matteo, who's on the call, and I had taken a lot of shots of doors and windows. And generally when I travel, I take a lot of pictures of doors and windows. And I had this idea to do a kallitype series of doors and windows where I could also hand color. So the images that you see on this slide on the right are different images that are in the exhibit that's called Alternate Paths. It's an exhibit that opened like a day before Rochester shut down for the COVID-19 crisis. So nobody's really seen this work except for where I've shared it on social media. I'm in the show with a few other photographers, Pat Bacon, who might be on the call, John Merritt, who was one of our previous speakers, Marianne Poyman, who's here with us today, and Bill Bates, who I think is probably working today. But anyway, you get a chance to see a little bit more of my work and some of the color tones that are in this particular series, which I love. They're just like very natural greens and browns and yellows and things like that. So I want to show a few slides now that kind of walk through like the technicalities of like how you make a kallitype. So the first thing that you do, and I'm again starting always with a digital image. If you don't have a digital image to begin with, and you have like a 35mm negative or a 110 negative, you're still going to need to scan that because you're going to want it to be bigger. So you need to make it larger, and then you need to manipulate the S curve to increase the contrast, or actually reduce the contrast, so that it's going to work for this process. So this is just a screenshot of Photoshop showing one of my original images. This is like footprints and snow. You can see how blue it is because I'm shooting with an iPhone, so I didn't have any filters to try to get it to be more along the white scale. But the first thing that you do is you convert it to black and white. So you get rid of all your color, and then you want to mess with the curve. So this is a screenshot showing where all the information in my image is and how I use these little points to sort of reduce out the whites and reduce out the blacks and essentially flatten the image because the contrast comes in through the chemistry. And then your final steps are, once you get the curve the way that you want it and it sort of looks more flat on the screen, then you flip it on the horizontal and you invert it to make it into a negative. And you want it to ultimately be as dense as possible so that a lot of ink gets sort of printed onto the plastic that you're going to use as the negative. So you effectively have some UV blocking when you make your contact print. So there's a couple of like GIFs, little animations now that I'll include that show you like me working in the darkroom, and I'm going to talk over the top of these. Let's say you get your great negative and then you're ready to make a print. There's always a process of testing your work, and John, my former instructor, was always a big advocate of, you know, make the negative, print the negative, make sure the negative is good, go back and make another negative if the negative's not good, before you print all your negatives, and then you've used a bunch of plastic paper for stuff that may not work out. So this is me, you know, going through the motions of sort of like testing. You are essentially combining two chemicals, silver nitrate and ferric oxalate. You're dropping them into, like in this case, a little shot glass in equal measure. And for an 8x10 piece of paper, I'm usually using like anywhere between 12 and 15 drops of each chemical. Once you make a print, if you decide it's not quite contrasty enough, you can also use something called tween, which is also known as ammonium dichromate. So that will just help to sort of boost up the contrast, but I didn't need it for these. The paper that I'm using is generally I'm using Fabriano cold press watercolor paper, which I like the tooth of the paper and I like how it holds the chemistry, but you could use a variety of different papers, and I've experimented with all kinds of things like Awagami Gampi paper and Hanamula rag paper and Stonehenge printmakers paper. Probably my favorite paper actually is Arches Platine, but that's a little bit more expensive and I don't usually buy a lot of that, especially since my work is so trial and error. But you can see here on the right that after you get all your drops, you're basically going to mix them in this shot glass, and you really need to make sure that you give it a good swirl, otherwise you can get varying results in the tones. After you've mixed chemistry, you want to apply it to the paper. And there's different ways of doing this. Some people will pour it right out of the shot glass directly onto the paper and use like a plastic, like a roll bar, and roll the chemistry. I like applying it with a brush that lets me see the brush strokes. And you can see a faint sort of yellow tone to the chemistry that you can see on the paper. And although I'm usually working with some red lights so that there's enough visibility that I can ensure I have a good coat, this is not super light sensitive until it goes into the UV light box. So you can actually have the window a little bit open and get enough light. And then once the paper is coated, the GIF on the right is sort of showing you how shiny it is, and then I could see if my coverage was complete or not. And then once my paper would dry, and most times I'm not patient to wait for it to dry, so I'm forced drying it with a blow dryer, then you're going to find your negative and you're going to make your contact print. So here on the left, this is a cabbage negative. I'm going to show you now a few more slides that are me making work just of that negative. This is my UV light box in the background, and I say mine, but I don't own it. It belongs to the Flower City Art Center. You can see how large the negative is next to the piece of paper. And on the far right here, I'm just placing it directly on top with the emulsion side down. And then there's a glass piece that's going to come down and sort of make like a tight sandwich so that the negative and the paper don't slide around. And then I'm going to close up the box and turn on the lights. And most of my exposures are anywhere between 1 and 5 minutes. I've been pretty lucky not to have to make longer exposures, but I've read with this process, sometimes the exposures need to be, I think maybe if you're doing it outside, maybe 20 minutes to an hour. So for me, again, you know, with haste in mind, I'm looking for the shortest exposures. And then after the print comes out, you are going to run it through a series of baths. It's going to get developed, and there's numerous different developers that are available for this process. I settled on my favorite, which is ammonium citrate, because I really like the finished tone. There's also a black developer, which comes with the Bostic & Sullivan kallitype kit, if you just wanted to buy the kit, and it comes with everything. There's also a sodium citrate developer, which is the one that's used more commonly with the palladium and platinum printing. And I did like that, but I found that the tone was a little bit more brown than I wanted. So I stuck with the ammonium citrate. So I hope these 3 GIFs moving like this are not giving you guys like vertigo, but the one on the left side here, if you watch it, you can see that I'm basically taking what looks like a sort of the image is like a shadow on the paper when it comes out of the light box. And as soon as I put it in the developer, the image comes right up. So you know right away if you have a good exposure or not. And you're really only leaving it in the developer longer to bring out the shadows and the detail in the shadows if there is any. So when you're making a test print, a minute in the developer is adequate. But when you're making an archival print, you're really leaving it in there for 5 to 8 minutes. And then after it comes out of the developer, you're going to wash it. And this yellow tray represents my washing bath. And what I would do is this particular tray, I would wash from the developer, and then it would go into the Selenium, which is the one on the far right here that I'll talk more about in a minute. And then after the Selenium, back into the yellow tray. So filling and dumping and clearing the tray in between. And then after washing it again into the fixer, which is the red tray, which I don't have a GIF for because nothing really exciting happens in there. And then back into the yellow tray again. So I've got all of these trays before I get to my final wash. The selenium that I'm using is a 1% selenium solution, which is enough to affect a color shift. And so I hope if you look at these 3 together, you can sort of see that the first 2 have a little bit more of a goldenish brownish color. And in the water bath, a lot of times there's even some bleaching that occurs. So your original developed image starts to look washed out. But then when it goes into the selenium, it actually darkens back up again. And it may take somewhere between 15 seconds and 2 minutes to affect the color shift that you want. And for me, I was really going for the cooling tone. So sort of like from that almost like yellowy brown to more of like a burnt umbria color. And I would know based on the selenium color shift, what it was going to dry down. So usually it dries down a teeny bit darker, but you know, in these cases, I just liked that cooler end tone. And then I've got a little GIF here just showing you with the process that once the image is dried down, for the ones that are vegetation or flowers or different organic matter, I'm always hand coloring them. I'm not bringing them up to being super colored like the original, but I'm usually going over and over and over the image with numerous different colors to bring out some of the small details. So I'll show you now. The next slide shows the original cabbage print that I first started with as an iPhone image on my phone, then the dried down kallitype after I made the negative, made the print, and completely let it dry. And on the far right is the colored cabbage, and it's not done yet. It needs to be a little bit more, I want it to be maybe a little bit more like yellowy orange on the inside and a little bit more blue, sorry, yellowy green on the inside and a little bit more bluish green on the outside. So I'm still working on the colors on that one. but you can see sort of the life or the transition. And sort of to summarize, so I'm always starting with the iPhone photo, then manipulating it in Photoshop, making a digital negative, and then it goes through like more like a darkroom process where I'm hand applying the emulsion to the paper, and I'm making my print, I'm developing, fixing, toning, washing, and then I'm applying watercolor. And then in order to make these presentations, or in order to update my blog, or in order to share work electronically, I'm digitizing it again. So it's always starting electronic and ending electronic, even though the part that I really love is in between, is that whole process of, you know, making it into something else. So what's going to happen next for me is that at the moment, I'm really enjoying using this little cheap clip-on macro lens on my iPhone. I was gifted one of these little clip-ons by Marianne years ago, and to be honest, I wasn't exactly sure what to do with it until pretty recently. A group of folks that I work with wanted to play around with making macro images, and so I got my lens out, and we brought a bunch of different things like spices and salt and flower petals into the office, and we were all sort of playing around, and it was like all of a sudden, oh my God, I can see all these details when I have good light. And so I've been spending, I don't know, I would say it's about a year now, making a lot of macro images, and I really love the texture and you know, the distortion that you get where there's only a small piece of the image that's really, really in focus, and the rest sort of is a little bit blurry. And I think that I'm going to, my next set of kallitype negatives are going to be these types of images. Sorry for the creaking in the background there. We're going to actually have, excuse me, I'll do maybe a series of these where I'll again hand color them. And I don't know, maybe I'll do an online exhibition of some kind, or there'll be another opportunity to show work, maybe in a show at the center or something like that in the future. But this is the kind of thing where I'd like to experiment a bit more with, you know, what will these look like blown up? I haven't done any of the macro images with the kallitype process yet, so I'm excited to sort of play with those a little bit. So if you've enjoyed seeing some of my work here, if you'd like to see more of my work, I am on Instagram. I have a whole Instagram feed that's just about my kallitype work. I have a website which includes a blog, which is the www.kallitypegirl.com. On that blog, I also have links back to the blog that I wrote when I was an artist in residence, which includes a lot more of my trial and error and my process. And then I also have a YouTube channel, and the the Flower City Art Center has their own YouTube channel. And so this recording, or this session, is being recorded and will be available as a YouTube video on the bottom link there, the youtube.com/user-rochester-arts. So right now, I think I've covered all of my content, and we can go ahead and take folks off mute if anybody's got any questions or comments for me. I'm going to also leave the slide. Well, I've got a slide for Q&A, but I can go backwards into any of the slides if anyone has any specific questions about anything that I've shown about the process or anything else.
Great job, Jen.
Thank you.
I'm always so impressed. You're so organized. I want you to start an artist rep business.
That sounds good, Pat.
Always so enthusiastic. You explain artwork so well.
Yeah.
You know, I realize as an artist, you need to be articulate and stuff. Some of us are not gifted that way. I just, really nice presentation. So clear, nice, good enthusiasm. Nice
Thank
job.
you. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you so much, Jen. It's been interesting to see your development throughout the years. And you really got stuck on kallitype. You know, I think that's interesting. And taking the class 4 times, you kind of inspired me to try the class. I've never done it. So what is it, like, I'm not particularly a process person myself, you know, like, or a studio artist per se. I'm very digital. So can you talk about how your love for process developed?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, Juliana, because, you know, I think it actually became born by wanting to be in the darkroom longer with my community of friends.
Yeah.
By, you know, when you go in the darkroom and you've got your film to develop, okay, well, you're in there for an hour and a half or so developing your film, and then after your film is developed, you got to wait for it to dry. So what do? You might sit down and look at each other's work or chit chat or wait, or else you leave the darkroom and that interaction finishes.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you come back and you're using your negatives and you want to make prints again, you know, how long will your darkroom session be? And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. And we would be fortunate that sometimes there'd be up to 4 of us working in the darkroom together, where we'd see the progression of each person's print and little tweaks and burning and dodging and, you know, looking at it under the light. And I really liked all of that. So to me, even though, you know, you think of maybe making the image as more simple, all of those steps in between, like that time spent doing the the processing of the negatives and then the developing of the prints and the interaction with the people, I really liked all of that. And you guys, if you don't know me professionally, my background is I'm a trainer, I'm a teacher. So that comes through, I think, a lot when I make presentations like this, but it also lends itself to that concept of process. I'm very used to, you know, thinking in advance, what do I want to present, creating an agenda with a bunch of different topics, doing some research and background, getting it ingrained in my mind, producing some slides. And so when I started taking the alternative process classes, I think one of the things that I just fell in love with was that at any point in that process, it could go horribly wrong. And the fact that you could get to the end with something that worked was like a miracle. And that's honestly how I felt with the wet plate collodion. I can't tell you how many times, and I've shared this with Emilio when he's been going back and forth with some of his trial and error. If you don't scrub the glass so clean, maybe the collodion just lifts right off of it when you put it into the first bath. Or when you're making a tint type, if you aren't really being careful that there's no dust on it and you pour the collodion, it's going to have marks all over it or little hairs in it or things that are going to impact your vision of, you know, perfection. And I just, because I think in my life I move very quickly from things to things, I'm not a perfectionist. I'm very much a get things done. You know, I think there's people on this call that can attest to that mentality, that I'm like, let's just move aside. Let me get it done. Like I'm, you know, I don't have a lot of time sometimes for like the minutia of the details. But I love that end process that, you know, if I make this one, for example, this is my cabbage print. If I make my cabbage print a few more times, they'll all be different, but they'll all be great. Like, and this is, it's also so hard for me to like sell them or give them away or share them because I love them all, even if I have like 10 of what appear to be like the same thing. Yeah, I think that's what it is for me. It's like that combination of not being perfect, having this background of being a person who sort of prepares, even though maybe those two things seem like they go together, but not really in my mind. And still getting an outcome that always looks interesting, even when, you know, 5 or 6 things might have not been how you anticipated. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions for Jen? No. Wow.
Do you ever do take the process on the road?
That's a good question, Mary. Yeah, I've taken a couple of classes actually through the darkroom where we took large format cameras into the field and we did dry plate tint types, and you know, we made work there, but we didn't have the rest of the sort of traveling darkroom with us to process them. We always took all the plates back into the darkroom and then we processed them there. For me, the closest thing that I get nowadays is I make the work all the time. Like meaning I'm taking images or taking pictures all the time with kallitype in mind. Like I see something and I'm like, that would be cool kallityped because of the texture, because of the opportunity for contrast, because of the chance to do some hand coloring. So my eye has really changed to how I look at work that I want to use for this process. There's no real reason why I couldn't take smaller jars of kallitype chemistry with me when I would go places with my own brush, with my apron. I could probably do most everything without even having a proper darkroom, because you don't need to be really in the dark. You just need a sink. Like the hardest part is you need enough running water to properly wash. And, you know, I didn't really talk about the history of this process, but I'll just take a moment to give some background. back in the 1840s is when this process first became a thing, quote unquote. So you had a bunch of photographers at that time that were all creative and figuring out different processes and different ways to make photography long lasting and permanent. And there's a photographer named, I think it's J.W.W. Nickel, who created this particular kallitype process. But at the time, rather than mixing the silver nitrate and the ferric oxalate into a solution, which was then applied to paper or a surface of some kind, he was actually putting the ferric oxalate on the paper and then developing the paper into a developer of silver nitrate. And then he was using a more like bleach type fixer. So you were getting this, what ended up as a result of that early process was this belief that the kallitype process was volatile and was temporary. So people would say, well, I don't want kallitypes because it's going to bleach out and it's going to, you won't even have it, you know, you put it on your wall and it's going to disappear. Or the volatility came in the fact that the silver nitrate as a developer would become exhausted so quickly and there was no way to replenish it, that you basically only had one shot the first time you mix the chemistry to get it all right. And you could really not use it over and over and over again and get the same result. So, you know, like for me right now, even in the darkroom, like I start out with my developer, it's good for maybe 5 to 8 prints. My Selenium's good for maybe 15 to 20 prints. My fixer is good for maybe 25 to 50 prints, depending. And so each time that you go through a bath, you've diminished sort of the integrity of that chemical a little bit more, like you've deposited some more silver into it, it's contaminated a little bit, it's aged, it's oxidized. All of those things mean also that, you know, you never have that sort of perfect world scenario where the chemistry is all fresh, all new. Those would be the challenges of bringing this onto the road, right? Is that sort of circling back, the water washing and sort of the changes to the kallitype process where they decided it would be more stable when you mix the emulsion and then apply it, and changing the fixer a bit. I use sodium thiosulfate, which is like a bleach, but because there's such extensive washing, there's like 10 trays of water filled and dumped with live running water over the top before it even goes into the running bath, where it sits there for another half an hour. So each print takes me like 45 minutes to make. I think it would be sort of neat maybe to come to someone's house where they have a sink where they didn't mind if there was a little bit of silver staining and you could have, you know, at least that wet part of it. Yeah, but I like the community darkroom. It's like my second home. So going back there and knowing I can always go back there to continue my work, I mean, that's a big part of, I think, me being a part of this artistic community here in Rochester.
Definitely. Can you talk real quick about the selenium portion of it? Do you have to use a toner, or is it something you just decided to do?
Yep, so it's a good question. So John Merritt and also Bill Bates, who a lot of folks on the call here know, they are big proponents of using toners, which do two things. Toners actually increase or improve the archival nature of your finished image. So if you put a toner like selenium or a gold toner, or those are the two primarily that I have used with kallitype process, but there are numerous other toners that you can use. They will actually help the print to last for 100 years or more. They also affect a color shift. So although I personally haven't had the experience with kallitypes, I've done a lot of reading where the different chemicals that you use as toners can actually change that sort of cool, dark brown or grayish brown that I'm getting as my final color. So let me go back here. This color that you see here in the middle is the selenium toned. If I didn't selenium tone it, which you don't have to, I could stop and not tone, it would be more brown. Is that terrible? No, it sort of looks like it's sepia, and I really do like that too. But I was feeling like for the hand coloring that the brownish color was taking away and it made the resulting image look a little washed out. So I liked a little teeny bit more darkness or more contrast as the backdrop for my hand coloring. So to go back to your question, you don't have to tone, but the tone will give you the archival permanence, and it'll also give you a color shift. I've read even some stuff that you can get this to look purple, or like really like a rusty red, which I think would really be interesting if you wanted to do something along the lines of like anthotypes, where anthotypes utilize, you know, you're making an emulsion out of vegetables or flowers or things found in nature. And so you can get like this incredible range of colors and a photographic image that to me is almost like a shadow or a photogram or even like a cyanotype with a botanical. And so you can use the toners to get a bigger range of all those colors. Yeah. I know Bill Bates is always telling me he's got a jar or a bottle of gold toner in his drawer, and he's like, just use it. Just play with it. Just take it anytime you want. And I don't have a lot of confidence because it's gold, so it's very expensive, you know, but.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you were a resident, didn't you create a book of your work? Do you want to talk about
did.
that?
Sure. I didn't think to put a screenshot of that in here, but you can see about it on my website, my blog too. Actually, you know what? I have one right next to me. So I made a book which has, so I should go back and just explain a little bit more too. My original vision for my solo exhibit when Megan approached me with the idea was to have 10 images in a show. And then I went and I made two bodies of work, a body of work that was sort of like vegetation and vegetables, that it had the selenium toning and the hand coloring, and a body of work that was all about winter. It was all snow and texture and winter scenes. And then I asked several of my most trusted advisors, Sharon, Marianne, Susan Anderson, I think Megan was there, to meet me in the darkroom so I could put everything out on a table and figure out which were the 10. Because at that point I had like 30 and I was sort of looking at it all like, oh my God, I love all of it. So I'm not going to be a good judge. And I'm also, just true confessions here, I'm a terrible person to cull down my image. I need a special one-on-one brainwashing session with Steve MD to help me see where to get rid of stuff, because I have literally like hundreds and even thousands, 10,000s of images that I'm holding on to because I might make something with them at some point. I don't know. So anyway, after that session with my advisors, we decided to pick 12 images of each body of work, total of 24, and then include a 25th image, which was not quite finished, but would allow people to see a little bit more of the brush strokes and the hand applied coating. And then at the end of the image, or at the end of the show rather, a lot of people were asking me about making a book. That involved like scanning all the work and like working again in another digital application that I wasn't real confident with. And it took me 3 trials, but I did get a good book. And I'll just open up a few, like, so here's, you can see in the book, I chose to go with a large size. The book itself is like, I don't know, I think it's like 14 inches square, so that these images, which are 8 by 10s, are almost exactly the full size. In the book, there's more information about where the work was made. My artist statement from my show is there. This is the image, which was not, hopefully you guys can see that there's a bit of glare on that, but it's chive blossoms. And you can see all the brush strokes. We chose not to matte that one because the exhibit actually had the work completely matted and framed. So with that particular image, we liked it from the sort of like what the subject was, and it fit with that theme of vegetation. But the problem was that the brush strokes were different from all the other brush strokes and harder for me to matte and sort of hide the messiness of the brush strokes, and that inconsistency we thought would take away or detract from the show. So all of the other images we chose to matte tight directly to the image itself to sort of hide all of those brush strokes, with the exception of that, because we thought people could understand a bit more about the process. So that one was just in a frame, but like sitting on top of a board. And then I sold the books, and they were really expensive to produce. They were like, I think they were a little bit more than $70 with shipping. And I was lucky to get a couple coupons. So I was able to order in bulk a few times to get a percentage of money off. But we ended up selling the books for that flat cost of $70. Actually, I think the books were $96 each. And then with the bulk and the bulk discount, we got them down to $70 each. So I still have a few books left. If anybody is interested, yeah. I think there's one in the darkroom. There might be one in the darkroom in the library.
So if anyone does want to get one, it's through your website?
Yeah, well, you could, anybody that knows me that's here from Rochester, you could just private message me. There is information on the website about the book, and there's some contact stuff, but I used WordPress editor, so I don't have commerce on my site. So I can't really sell through the site. So you still have to contact me separately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Any final questions or comments for Jen?
Fantastic. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
Jen, if you were speaking about content when you're editing,
yeah,
doing a series, do you feel there's certain themes or content that allows you to edit, or what you're searching for when you're taking a photograph, or is it pretty based on aesthetics or design?
Yeah, it's hard for me, Pat. I think, you know, with the 2 bodies of work that I did for, let me see if I can stop this and share. One moment. So this is my website. Is that still sharing?
Yes.
Can you guys see that? Okay. So in here, I have my residency, and there are some links that take you to see different work. And I'm going to actually show the winter series. I think this is, oh no, that's the wrong thing. Sorry. You don't want to hear that while I'm talking. Sorry. Where is my, I think it's gallery. Sorry, going to the wrong link. I want to show you this. So can you guys see that? The winter series, I know it might be a little bit small. So when we were trying to decide, like when we talk about content, we're trying to decide like what to include, what to leave out. This was the final body of work for like the winter series. I had many more images, including the winter road that I already showed you guys earlier in my slide presentation. I had another one of like pine trees, which was really close up on the pine trees and the needles and the snow on the needles. And I was trying to look for like pairs of images that could go together, ones that could, you know, easily on the wall go together, ones where there was either a similar tone or some graphical stuff that sort of like would make like a, what do you want to say? Like a, I'm losing my train of thought.
Like
but
a visual connection.
Yeah, like a visual connection, so that you could see the progression or like see a path through them. And I don't remember exactly how we hung these on the wall, but you can see that I've got, you know, this one with the shadow and this one with the branches. And then I've got 2 different ones with icicles, and I've got a bunch of them that are like the snow ripples, the snow shadows, the snow crust, and the snow scales were all textural. Sometimes it's really obvious what doesn't go. Like for me, because there's no other like sort of man-made anything in this body of work, the road didn't fit. So I couldn't include the road in there, even though I love that image. And I also had a bunch of other ones where there was like other footprints or other shadows, but I felt like the, you know, I didn't want to over-represent the same theme or the same topic over and over. When I'm looking at, let's see, if I go back to my there's the information about the book there, Juliana.
Okay.
If I go to my other kallitypes, I'll just show you, like when I was talking about like organic matter or things to include in the vegetable series, I have things like this, like seaweed or other ones where, again, I think they're really interesting images, but they just, you know, there was maybe something about the shape or the density of the darkness in the image or something that made me decide to leave it out. Generally though, I'm not a good judge. I mean, I need other people. Like this lettuce and turnips, this is probably a better one to tell you about something we left out. Initially, there was no hand, like there's no hand coloring. I have since colored it. But because of the lattice in the background, like I loved the angle I loved the texture in the turnips and in the wood lattice itself, but I didn't have anything else like that. And so this one stood out when I looked at all the other ones, which were primarily focusing on the vegetable itself or the cactus itself or something like that. It's interesting too, because I've even had some suggestions like, what about using, you know, making landscapes and doing the kallitype process with landscapes? But the issue that I have with that is I feel like the iPhone does some things really well. I can take a landscape picture on my iPhone, and sure, it's a beautiful picture, but when I try to make that into a negative, there's not enough information or detail for you to really appreciate it as a negative, as a kallitype. Whereas with, you've got the close-up of the vegetables, there's a lot more information in there. There's a lot more interest in all the small details. And I just think that it lends itself between the brush strokes and the chemistry. Yeah. So, but I always need help. I always need to show all my stuff to somebody else, which is why I love our Darkroom Club that we have, where people can, you know, look at things. Of course, it's not super helpful when everybody just says, oh, I love everything, because that's exactly how I feel. But, you know, I think once people, you know, there's people that are definitely better at doing sort of the culling. That's why I made the reference to Steve. You know, Steve makes zines all the time. And his zines show a collection of photographs from a much larger body of work. And they always really tell a beautiful story, and they work so well together. And I like that idea of making zines, like a smaller booklet, something that's cheaper to produce. But I'm kind of struggling a little bit with like making the kallitypes and then digitizing all of them again, and then getting the balance of color and contrast right in the images. Because to make that book probably took me like 6 weeks with multiple trial and errors of sending a file off to the publisher, getting a book back, no way to have a proof in between. So I'd get a book in the mail and it would not be good. And then I would have to go back in and tweak all the images again. Like at one point I had the wrong color profile. Another time I had an issue with the contrast and everything being too dark. I don't know, I'm sort of jumping around, Pat, but does that answer your question a little bit or give you some insight into my thinking?
Yeah, I just want to know if you were more of a formalist than of a content, but I think that the whole idea of the process is real important to you and showing it in your work.
Yeah.
And that's down, you know, the life process, slowing your life down.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Is part of the images, you know, to me. But yeah, I do like this lattice piece though, and the distance.
Yeah. Thank you.
It is a good point. Like all the details and the texture really sing with the kallitype process.
Mm-hmm.
So including more is good.
Yeah.
But also the little footprints in the snow, that's actually very beautiful too.
Yes, some of them that, like, I got really lucky, I think, with let's see if I go back one more.
Wow, yeah.
These are the vegetation ones, and I don't have like I did not put into my website like really big versions of these, but some of them, like the one of the wet grass, there's little beads of water on it that, you know, when I walked by the grass and the grass was wet, I thought it looked beautiful. When I made the negative, I thought it was really hard to pop the little water droplets out because of the contrast. But then when you apply color, they come right back out. So a lot of that stuff, when I'm looking at the images, when I'm taking pictures now, I'm looking for things like that. Like, what's it going to transfer? Like, yeah.
I know we're a little tiny bit over, but I have just one more question, and I'll give it to anyone who wants to ask a question. You can interrupt me. But so you have not tried your little macro lens. You haven't tried it with kallitype yet. And
No.
Okay, so I think that would be really, really interesting to see what you do next.
Yeah, these images right here are just a few of my favorite ones that I've taken that are sort of earmarked to make a kallitype negative into. So I think I had mentioned even to Juliana a couple weeks ago, I had a darkroom session and I was asking about if the printer had ink and if I could go ahead and make new negatives. And I ended up not making any, but these are the first set of images that I think I want to make. I like the fact that there's a little teeny bit of color you know, that'll give me something to paint into. And also the fact that none of them are so super dark, so it makes it a bit easier to adjust the curve. I think all of these, maybe this one would be a little bit more of a challenge, but I think that the whiteness in the snow will give me enough contrast to work with so that I don't have just a big black mass when I print it. I didn't actually scan some of the ones that I've made that have not turned out. I don't actually, let's see if I have anything here. I have, like, I'll just show you this right here. Can you guys see this?
Yeah.
So this was also one of my early kallitypes that I made in one of my first classes. But if you look at this dark area, there is detail in there, but you can barely see it, right? So I should have, so this is a combination of two things. This is overexposed, and the negative, really, I should have done more manipulation on the negative in order to bring those details out a little bit more. I still love this, but you know, like as Pat Kane would say, your eye is just like sucked into the void, and then you can't really appreciate the rest because you don't move around the image visually. So I always think of things like that when I'm, you know, when I'm looking at the image or thinking about how I'm going to edit it. And I did work with John one-on-one to make my negatives for my residency for the most part. I think there were probably 6 of them that I really needed help with. I won't keep going back and forth but he had to like help me like, what do you call it? Like select certain sections and then only adjust the curve within those sections in order to get it to print correctly, to make a really interesting print. I think actually Marianne, when I did my residency, I borrowed a lot of Marianne's frames because I had 25 images that needed to get framed, and I think I only had 6 images. So I borrowed a bunch from Marianne and a bunch from the Darkroom. And as a thank you, I gave Marianne one of my images at the end of the show, which was a tree trunk with a little snowdrift around it with a bunch of fallen leaves and acorns as debris in the bottom. That was incredibly difficult to print. I spent more time on that than anything else because the bark in the tree and the shadow in the snowdrift were such varying contrast levels that the tree was either completely muddy and dark in order to get the drift to show up, or the drift was blown out and you could barely see the details in the fallen debris in order to get the bark to look good. So we worked on that one for a long time. Yeah. But I'm really excited to do these.
Yeah, I think the shallow depth of field is going to be neat in the kallitype. Can't wait to see it.
Thanks.
Hey, Jen. Oh,
go ahead, Beth.
Hi. I had a quick question. Are you using RAW when you shoot on your phone? Are you just, no, you're not. Okay.
No, you know, I have a RAW app, and John Merritt had even recommended to shoot RAW because you get so much more information and you can do so much more with it when you're manipulating. But the files are so large. Yeah. They're so large to upload. They're so large to download. And I just, again, going back to my sort of like, who is Jen Pereña? She's not a patient person. So to wait all that time to upload something, or no. I think if I was going to make this more of a profession, though, that there's value in really mastering that. And I have seen some kallitypes, like there's this one person, Sandy King, that has a website devoted to kallitype photography, and they look like Ansel Adams images. I mean, the amount of detail, they are amazing. But I work another job and I do this sort of as a hobby, and I really do love it, but I'm cutting corners where I can to make my life balance is really what it is. Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you all very much for your time today, and thanks.